Welcome to InDesign, a program that's often overlooked by new designers, but as a working designer, it may be the program that you use the most. Photoshop is all about creating raster images, and Illustrator is all about creating vector images. InDesign is about taking those images and putting them into a layout. So often in InDesign, you'll be working seamlessly with the other Adobe programs to create the layout you want. InDesign works fast, and it's extremely powerful, especially for multi-page documents. Let's go ahead and dive in and show you some of the basics of how it works. Let's click Create New, and just like the other Adobe programs, we get this dialog box, and there's a lot of similarities to the other programs. You have presets for print and web, so you want to think about whether the document you're creating will be printed or viewed on a screen. I'm going to go with print. I'm going to choose the letter preset, which is 8.5 by 11. And just like other Adobe programs, you have a choice of units. By default, you're going to be working in picas, but I like to work in inches because it's a little bit more intuitive. You also have this button for facing pages. This is going to be checked if you are working with a document that is bound. So if you think about a bound book, even if the page size might be 8.5 by 11, when you open it up, you're actually looking at 2 pages at once. And that's what facing pages is all about. It's about working in spreads rather than single pages. In this case, I'm going to uncheck facing pages. And then down at the bottom, you have a bunch of options for columns and margins. I'm going to go ahead and leave these blank for now, but these are going to come in handy further down the line when we're creating more complex layouts. Let's just go ahead and skip the rest of these options and click Create. This is what the default workspace looks like in InDesign, and it's really similar to a lot of the other Adobe programs. By default, you'll be on the Essentials workspace, but I like to switch to the Typography workspace because it'll add a lot of useful features to your panels. Another really annoying thing about the Essentials workspace is by default, it doesn't actually have a toolbar, which I just find to be very counterintuitive. You can always add the toolbar by going up to Window and down to Tools. But still, I like going to Workspace and switching to Typography. Again, this is going to add a lot of features to your panels, which are going to come in handy. Most of the functions in InDesign are pretty intuitive and are similar to the functionality in Illustrator and Photoshop. For instance, the Type tool is pretty basic. You can click and drag to make an area. Then if you type something in, it'll create type. If I highlight that type, I'm hitting Command A to select all. I can go to the character panel to make adjustments to the size, to the leading, which isn't doing anything because I only have one line of type, to the tracking, etc. You can also change the font and the font weight with the drop downs at the top. In the paragraph panel, just like other programs, you can change the alignment, and you can do things like add indents and spacing. So these functions should be pretty familiar to you. But if they're not, dive in there and just play around with what they do. We will be working more with these as we start working with documents with a lot of type. Images, however, are a little bit different. This is where InDesign has a bit of a different system. Images use sort of a box within a box system in InDesign to allow for easy cropping, which is a really common function when working with layouts. To show you what I mean, let's go ahead and drag in a folder that I have from my operating system where I have an image that I want to place in my InDesign document. If I go ahead and drag this into InDesign, when I regain focus on InDesign, you can see that image is sort of loaded into my cursor, which is a little bit strange, but basically what InDesign is doing is it's placing this image into the document. Images in InDesign by default are linked instead of being embedded. I'll talk more about that in a second. So let's go ahead and just click to see what happens. When I do that, you can see that it places the image and it uses the cursor as the top left reference point for the placement of the image. And this image was really big. When you click to place an image, it actually puts it at 100%. And so the result is the image is way too big in the layout. If I zoom out by holding down Option and using the scroll wheel, you can see that the image is many, many times larger than our actual document, which is over here. So I could resize this and sort of bring it back down to the right shape, But let's go ahead and try a different way of putting this into the document. So I'm going to hit Command 1 to bring our size back to something reasonable. And then let's go ahead and undo to undo the placing of that image. Okay, so this time, instead of clicking just once, I'm going to click and drag, and now it's going to give me control over how big the image is that I'm placing. And then when I release, it's going to place that image into that zone. It's going to lock me into having the right proportions. So it's not going to let me place it with incorrect proportions, which is good. That's generally what I want. So now let's say we want to go ahead and resize this image. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Okay, let's say we want to make it a little bit smaller. Let's grab the corner and reduce it down. And what you would expect to happen isn't really what happens, because instead of shrinking down the image, it actually crops the image down. The same thing happens when I go from the other side. You can see it's really just leaving the image at the same size, and it's cropping it down to a smaller bounding box. Okay, so the reason for that is because of this box in a box method. In InDesign, by default, when you click and resize, you're actually changing the size of that bounding box. If you want to change the size of the image inside, you either have to grab the direct select tool. Okay, and when I do that and click, you can see that the bounding box is now brown. That's telling me that I'm actually selecting the image inside rather than the frame. Okay, so now when I resize, you can see I'm selecting and resizing the actual image and leaving the bounding box on its own. And I can do the same for moving this around. Okay, so you can see I'm sort of moving an image within a frame. You can also do that with the regular selection tool if you just click this little circle in the middle. So when I hover over the image, if I click here, I get the blue bounding box, which is the frame. But if instead I click on this little circle, I get the brown bounding box, which is the image. So definitely play around with this a little bit to get a feel for how this works. And like I said, it's a little bit unintuitive at first, but once you get the hang of it, it actually is much faster and allows you to crop and work with images in a much slicker way. Another thing that we can do that's a nice shortcut is if you hold down Command while you resize the outer bounding box, it'll resize the image inside the same amount. So let's go ahead and hold down hold down Command, and then if I hold down Shift, it's also going to constrain my proportions so that I don't, skew the image. Okay, so that's a really good way to work. And obviously, if you don't hold down Shift, you're going to get some skewing problems with the image. So make sure you always hold down Shift along with Command to resize both of those at once. You can also put images into InDesign through the Place function, which is under File and Place, or you can hit Command D. When you do this, it's going to work in a very similar way, except it's going to open up a dialog box to find the image in your operating system. So if you browse to that image, you can click Open, and it's going to work in a really similar way, where it's going to load that into your cursor. So now I have a second instance of that image. And like I was saying, images in InDesign are linked rather than embedded. So if I go to the links panel, you can see that I actually have these images listed, and there's two instances of this same image. The links panel is all about sort of managing all of those links and giving you some information about them. Okay, so if I go back to that folder where I have the image, let's say that I want to put this in a new folder. Okay, now I've changed the location of that original image. So if I go back to my links panel, it's now giving me this red question mark because it's saying it can't actually find that file. This is one of the downsides to working with linked images, is that if the image moves, you're not going to have it in your document anymore. So you always need to make sure you are managing the location of your images correctly. If these images were embedded, sure, you'd be able to have them no matter what, but the downside to that is it's really going to slow down your file. And InDesign is known for being a really quick program, and a lot of that is due to the fact that it links images rather than embeds them. Okay, so since these are missing, they're not going to show up as full resolution. And if I print this image, it's actually not going to look correct. It's going to be super pixelated. That's because it only has a very low resolution preview of the file in the InDesign file. Okay, so in order to see this image at full resolution again, I have to relink these images. So I can always go down here and click this little button for relink. And then if I just find that same image, which I put in this folder for untitled folder, okay, and then click open, now it's happy again because it found that image and it's relinked. So since there's no red question mark anymore, it means that this is totally good to go. And when I print it, it's going to be high resolution again. A few other really nice shortcuts to know about when you're working in InDesign are the W key. Okay, and the W key toggles between sort of a preview mode and a regular mode. And it helps because if you have a bunch of guidelines and bounding boxes for images, it helps you see what your document looks like in a more natural way. It's a really easy button to press, so it's a lot of times good to just toggle back and forth between those two modes to see what you're actually looking at. And then another really useful one is Shift W, which puts you in a full screen preview mode with none of the UI. So again, this is really useful for just seeing what you're doing. If you want to leave this mode, you can hit Escape to get back to where you were. One thing to be aware of is if you're working with type, sometimes you will be hitting W and trying to sort of toggle those modes, or Shift W to toggle the preview mode, and it'll actually be typing into your text box. So just know that if you're going to use this mode, you have to make sure that you're not actively in a text box. Otherwise, it's going to cause you some issues, and you might end up with a bunch of extra W's inside of your text. So that's just something to be careful about. One last way that you can work with images in InDesign is by creating a frame. So let's go ahead and clear all this stuff out. Using the selection tool, I'm just going to select everything and hit delete to delete everything. Now let's go over here to the rectangular frame tool. Okay, so this is a little bit different than the regular rectangle tool because it's all about creating frames. So if I grab the regular rectangle tool, it's going to work exactly how you expect. And the colors are up here where you can, create a color or a stroke color. Okay, so that works just like other rectangle tools for the most part. Rectangular frame tool is a little bit different because when you use the frame tool, you're actually creating an area where you want to place some sort of object like an image. Okay, so if I go back to my image, which I have in this folder, it's now in this untitled folder. We go ahead and drag this. Okay, and when I drag it, you can see it's loading it into my cursor just like I expect. But when I hover over the frame, you can see the cursor changes ever so slightly. Instead of having a little dotted line in the upper left corner, it changes to being like these little parentheses around the image icon. That's giving me the option of sort of placing it into that frame. You can also place into the rectangle, but the frame is really meant for this exact purpose. Okay, so when I click on that frame, it's going to go ahead and place it, again, at 100%. And then if I want to scale down that image, I can select it, and I can select it by hitting that middle area. And sometimes people get confused because they select this and they say, hey, where's the brown bounding box? I'm not able to see that. But the reason in that case is because it's so big that I actually have to zoom out to even see that brown bounding box. So when I select it, you can always zoom out. And I'm zooming out by holding down Option and using the scroll wheel, which is a really fast way to zoom in and out. Okay, and then I can just scale this down. So that's just another way to work with frames. And frames are great for sort of specifying where you want to put images. Like I said, you can work with rectangles in a very similar way. If I go down and grab my image, I can place this in the rectangle as well, and it works similarly. But the frames are there to really mark off where you want to put your images at a later time. So a lot of times if you're creating some sort of template, or if you are creating a wireframe for your layout, putting down frames is a good way to know that that's where you want to put some sort of object later on.